Hello, my name is Frank Mazzotta and I'm one of the classical civilization teachers at New College, Swindon. This brief taster session is designed to give you a chance to explore what we actually study in classical civilization. It's a very unique subject, but one that is not widely studied. And so we're going to begin by clarifying what we actually mean by classical civilization. We're then going to explore what we study in classical civilization and what skills we apply. And then we're going to put that to the test by studying some different types of Greek mythology. And we're going to consider how they still influence us today. So what do we mean by the words classical civilization? The word classical is used quite a lot, but it's one of those words that's quite vague and hard to define. We might, for example, think classical music, or classical cars, classical cinema, classical literature. None of those things, of course, have very much in common, do they? But one thing does unify each of those, which is that you first of all there has to have been a certain amount of time to have passed for something to be considered a classic. You might say something like, well, this movie that came out this year will one day be a classic, but for example, a movie that came out last month isn't generally considered a classic just yet. So a certain amount of time has to have passed in order for it to be considered a classic, but one thing that does unify all of those examples is that classical influences modern. So what that means is, for example, that modern music, though of course it sounds very, very different than classical music, was directly influenced by and was a natural progression from classical music. Modern cars might pay homage to classical cars. Modern literature will be based on the forms and genres of classical literature. And so there's a recurring thread that the classical has an effect and influences the modern. And so when we study classical civilizations, we're studying it in the same approach. The classical civilizations are those that influence the modern world. In particular, we focus on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So linking to this then, we would define classical civilization then as in the subject as the study of the literature, culture, history and beliefs of ancient civilizations such as Greece and Rome. So if you enjoy a varied form of education, you enjoy looking at lots of different topics and disciplines, then this sort of course will appeal to you. And then we use this information to try and study how these beliefs, how their history, how their literature and how their culture has then shaped the modern world. Classical civilization is a very broad subject, and so we have to employ a wide range of topics and methods to try and study the ancient Greeks and their ancient Romans. So this includes a combination of studying some history. We cover some of the most important and influential events and people of the Greek and Roman world, and consider what effect they had on their respective cultures and on popular imagination up to the modern day. We study some of the world's earliest and greatest literature, such as Homer's Odyssey, Greek comedy and tragedy, and what we consider is how these forms and genres have then shaped modern literature and every sort of form of entertainment that we use today. So every movie you've ever watched, every book you've ever read, has all in some way been influenced by the ancient works. And we still adhere to some of the forms and genres that they set up 2,500 years ago. We explore the culture, values and beliefs of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and we consider the effects that these have had on our own modern culture. So for example, classical Athens was the birthplace of democracy, and of course this is still the government system that many modern societies still adhere to today. And we consider, for example, how Athenian democracy differs to modern democracies and how they conceive of their democracy, so how they view their democracy is different to our own. We study the religious beliefs of the ancient Greeks and Romans and how this affected their daily lives. And last but not least, we also study the mythology of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So most people will know of great heroes of Greek mythology such as Achilles or Hercules, dangerous monsters and creatures such as Cerberus and Medusa and the Minotaur, and the gods and goddesses, of course, that shaped the stories and lives of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. So for us, we interpret these stories as stories. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, of course, though, these were very much integral to their lives and values. Some ancient Greeks and Romans saw these as historical fact. Others saw them, like we do, as maybe more moral fables or tales. And so we explore how the mythologies and how the worldview of the Greeks and Romans with regards to their mythology helped to shape their values, and then how these values have then affected the modern world as well. So to give you a taster of exactly how we might study something like this, we're going to have a quick look at then some Greek mythology. So what we might ask then before we jump into it is, why study mythology in the first place? So it was, of course, as I said, an integral part of Greek and Roman civilization. Most of the Greeks, though not all, would have believed in the myths of Zeus and Athena as much as, let's say, modern religions would believe in their gods and prophets. It was real belief systems, let's say, for those people, just like a religious person might have belief in their gods today. But of course, we tend to associate mythology as something that is reserved for the distant past, that we're not affected by mythology today. Mythology is no longer, let's say, something that is common in our society. It's something that more historical or more primitive societies believed in. But we are kind of, let's say, we imagine ourselves removed from mythology. But when we broaden what we define mythology as actually being, we can begin to appreciate just how much mythology is still inherent, let's say, in shaping our beliefs and ideas. So, for example, the American Heritage Dictionary defines mythology as a fiction or half-truth, especially one that forms part of an ideology. So essentially, something that is either completely false or somewhat true, but of course we can't work out exactly what's true and what's false, but particularly as they say, something that helps shapes our beliefs and values. The Oxford Dictionary then defines mythology as a set of stories or beliefs about a particular person, institution, or situation, especially when exaggerated or fictitious. So as you can see then, the Oxford Dictionary focuses on the storytelling elements, but also the belief elements. So someone must, of course, believe in mythology in order for it to be important. And of course, it can be about a wide range of different things. People, places, events. It really doesn't matter. What's important, though, is who is believing them and how, of course, then that shapes their views of the world around them. There are quite literally hundreds of different types of myths when we really consider this, and especially when we start considering the different cultures of the world and how they shape myths and how they use myths, let's say, to shape the world around them. We could be here, let's say, all year just studying the different types of myths that are available. But for today, we're going to just focus on three specific types. They are creation myths, historical myths, and psychological myths. And what you're going to notice is that when we start broadening the terms and definitions of what we mean by myths and mythology, some of these beliefs and some of these myths still have an influence and are still prevalent in modern society and in modern thought. So, for example, creation myths then explain the reason why something is the way it is today. So most cultures, whether that be Greek and Roman, whether that be Egyptian, Norse, Mayan, Aztec, Chinese, Japanese, African, it doesn't really matter where you go. Most societies, both historically and we might say even in the modern world, will have some sort of story that explains their origin. So a nice example of that might be, from a religious perspective, the book of Genesis. That even the Catholic Church now acknowledges the biblical story of Adam and Eve and the world being created in 7 days and everything else like that is an example of a myth. It was the early Judeo-Christian writers who shaped this belief to try and explain how the world came into being. We might also consider, though, outside of creating the entire world, national founding myths. That might be another good example of these. So, for example, you might have heard of the story of Romulus and Remus, two twin brothers who were abandoned at birth and raised by a she-wolf, and then one day came back and founded the city of Rome, which is named after Romulus. We, of course, in Britain, have the legends of King Arthur, who we're not really sure whether he exists or not, but actually that's kind of besides the point. The idea is that he reflects the values and the beliefs, let's say, of whoever is writing about him and in different genre and in different periods. So medieval scholars might have talked about King Arthur in very, very different terms than we do. Historical myths are based on an historical event, but are warped or exaggerated to suit a particular purpose and to help keep the memory of that event alive. So a perfect example of this is probably something you must have studied at school at some time, or you may have seen documentaries on it or been told about it. But the Blitz during World War II, when of course, Nazi air raids were decimating parts of Britain. And of course, then the British showed the Blitz spirit, is the term we use, which is, the British's tenacity, let's say, our determination to resist Nazism and to resist the Nazi attempts to, let's say, frighten us and to make us surrender, with keeping, of course, a stiff upper lip. So it is, of course, it did, of course, happen, and it was not that this is a false thing, so it's not like it's a myth that's been completely made up, but of course, the concept of the Blitz spirit, as we call it, only really emerged after the Second World War. So people during the Blitz weren't going around saying, we're going to be part of the Blitz spirit, and one day in 75 years' time, students are going to be learning about this, and they're going to be talking about the Blitz spirit. Of course not. It was something that people did naturally, and only after the events did people look back and say, well, what can we use to try and explain the way that people acted back then? And then the idea, the myth of the Blitz spirit was emerged. So can you see how it is based on historical facts, of course? It's not like we're making this completely up, but it is slightly warped and it is slightly perhaps exaggerated or distorted to try and shape that viewpoint. The third type of myth then is psychological myths. So these are to try and explain the way we feel and act the way we do. So the Greeks and Romans are a perfect example of this. That anything that they couldn't understand in terms of how they feel or how they act, they explained as being divinely influenced. So, for example, they looked at young couples who were in love and they wondered, why is it that people who are in love tend to say and do very stupid things? And so they thought, well, it must be then that the goddess Aphrodite, or in Roman mythology, Venus, must have put some sort of spell on them. Or you may have heard the stories, of course, of Cupid, the little baby with the bow and arrows, firing, arrows into potential lovers, and of course, getting people to fall in love with each other. So that was how the Greeks and Romans conceived of certain feelings and certain beliefs, let's say. They believed that they were divinely influenced to certain things. We then, in a modern sense, might consider urban legends and myths as a good example of how our attitudes to everything from crime to even the paranormal can be shaped by semi-believable myths. So I bet any money you've probably heard the story at school at some point, and I'm sure a teacher must have said this to you, of a student who was in their class and they were rocking on the back of their chair and they fell off and hit their head and had to be taken to hospital or even worse. And when you start thinking about it, you think, well, every other teacher has told me that story. And every single time they see someone at the back of the class, rocking back on their chair, they always say, don't they? Oh, watch out. I remember a student a few years ago who fell off their chair and really hurt themselves. So either there's a whole, wave, let's say, every single year of students being taken into hospital for falling off their chairs and hitting their heads. Or, of course, maybe teachers are telling you a little bit of a myth. And of course, why do we tell that myth? Well, of course, we want that student to get off their chair, don't they? So to stop rocking on their chair. So it's just an example of how these things are still prevalent. They're not, of course, absolutely everywhere. We don't have the big complex stories of Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena and Ares and all these people, but they are still prevalent in our culture and they do still shape our beliefs, whether we like it or not. So let's put this knowledge to the test then by looking at some Greek mythology. So one way in which the Greeks would depict their myths was on vases that were decorated in homes across the Greek world. So Greek vases are an excellent source to try and understand Greek myth, because what they show us is just how diverse the Greek beliefs in these myths actually was. What I'd like you guys to do for me then is in a minute to pause this video, and in either the video description underneath if you're on YouTube or on the website, on the college website if you're going through the website to do this activity, I'd like you to download an attachment that is attached with this video. And in that document then is going to be different pictures of Greek vases that depict then, of course, some different mythological scenes. What I'd like you to do for me then is to see how many mythological figures you can identify. So that might be great heroes and heroines, it might be gods and goddesses, it might be monsters and beasts, there's a whole sort of variety in there. If you know anything about these stories, what I'd like to consider then is, first of all, how much can you remember about, for example, that particular mythological hero, goddess, or story, or whatever it is? And then consider for me, which of these myths are creation myths, so ones that explain why something is the way it is, which are historical myths, so ones that might be based a little bit in fact, but of course have been greatly distorted and warped over time, and then which are psychological myths, so ones that try and explain why they behave in a certain way. Once you've finished that, so you can take some notes or you can just consider some ideas as you're going through it, then I'd like you to resume the video and we'll be able to go through this together. So I'll walk you through some answers, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, by the way. It is all interpretation, but we can see what you can come up with. If you're not too sure about Greek mythology, so some people might not know as much as others, some people might know quite a lot because they've read a lot of books on it and watched a lot of documentaries and movies, other people might not, that is also completely fine. Okay, so we do start in classical civilization from the ground up. So if you know nothing, it's completely fine, we'll work from the absolute ground up. What you can do then, if you're not too sure much about Greek mythology, or you're a little bit stuck on some of the pictures, at the very, very bottom of the document, so on the very, very last page, is a cheat sheet that has some of the answers. And what you can do instead then, if you can't identify any, is see if you can match different descriptions of the vases and the stories to the vase themselves. Then what you can do is, at the very bottom of that page, there is a link to a website. And that website has a glossary for all different Greek mythological characters. So say, for example, you want to find out who Odysseus is, click on that link, go to the website, click on Odysseus, and it will tell you all about him. And then, of course, that will give you the background knowledge that you'll need to be able to answer that third question there. Does that make sense? So what you can do then is pause the video now, and then have a look at the activity, and then once you're finished, resume this, and of course, we'll go through it together. Okay, so I hope then you've looked at the vases, and you've made some notes on how many people you could identify, and then what types of myths you think they fall into. So there were 2 vases, you can see them on here, that depict some different scenes from Greek mythology. And so these would be considered then creation myths. So the one on the top left then, of this woman and this man sat on a couch together, is the story of Hades and Persephone. So Persephone then is the daughter of the goddess Demeter. Demeter was the goddess of harvests, so she would make things grow, whether that be food or just wild shrubs and trees and stuff. That was her duty, let's say. All of the Greek gods and goddesses had a particular duty, and hers was that. Hades, by contrast then, was the Greek god of the underworld. And so when people died in the ancient Greek world, they believed that their soul moved on to a place called Hades. And so this was the realm of the dead that was controlled, let's say, that was ruled by Hades himself. Now, according to the legends then, according to the story, Hades one day saw Persephone and he fell immediately mad in love with her. And so the problem was for him that because, of course, she was an above ground god or goddess, because, of course, her mum was in charge of growing things, and, of course, he's the god of the underworld, dead things, there wasn't really much of a chance, of course, of them ever living together, let's say, or ever matching up. And so he decided to kidnap her. So he one day sprung out of the ground, kidnapped Persephone, and took her back to the underworld to be his bride. The other Greek gods were really angry about this, of course, and so they went down, and particularly they sent one of the gods, Hermes, to go and try and recover Persephone, but he was very, very surprised when he got there, because when he got there, Persephone actually had fallen madly in love with Hades, and they were a very, very happy couple. So Hermes told Persephone, well, we want to bring you back up to the world above. Your mother, of course, is worried sick about you. And of course, this isn't your place. This isn't your home. The underworld is not for you. You're a goddess of growing things. But there had been a problem. That Hades had fed Persephone a pomegranate. And so you can see on the depiction of the vase itself, Hades, the guy on the right, is holding up like a little vase. So we think that we're not too sure exactly, because of course it's not completely clear on the depiction there, that this is the moment where he's offering Persephone the pomegranate. And she had eaten some seeds from the pomegranate, and unfortunately, according to Greek myth, if you ate or consumed anything in the in the underworld, then you were tied to that place. You couldn't leave it, basically. And so she was unable to leave. So Demeter got really, of course, upset that she'd never see her daughter again, and she neglected her duties, and summer turned to fall as the trees started to die and crops started to wither, and then everything died and autumn turned to winter, and the first winter came about. So before that, it was a perpetual summer. When Demeter got upset with the kidnap of her daughter, it then turned into winter. In the end, then the other gods got so fed up with the winter that they sent down Hermes again, and they struck a deal. And the deal was then that 6 months of the year, Persephone would go up to the world, and with Demeter very happy, things would grow again, so spring and summer. And then 6 months of the year, she would go back down to the underworld to be with her husband as queen of the underworld, Persephone, down there with Hades. And so then, of course, Demeter gets upset, and you can maybe see the trend here, autumn and winter. And so this story then was a way of the Greeks explaining why is it then, of course, year on year, we have one season where things start to grow, one season where everything's lovely and hot, one season then when things start to wither and die, and then, of course, one season where it's horrible and cold. And so it was a way of them explaining the seasons, essentially. So on the right, you can see the depiction of the creation of the first humans. So according to Greek mythology, when the gods wrested control of the earth from the Titans, Zeus decided that he wanted to populate the land with lots of different animals. And so he tasked 2 Titans, Prometheus and Epimetheus, 2 brothers, to create lots of different animals that could populate the earth. So they began creating, all the animals that we, and fish and birds and stuff that we see today. But very last, they created one more creature, one more animal, and that was then human beings. But most importantly, the humans were created in the image of the gods. So they were meant to look like the gods and be like the gods. So lots of the gods were very overjoyed to see these sort of, young creatures, let's say, and quite powerless, of course, creatures in comparison to the gods, going around the earth. And so to help them, all of the gods gave to the first humans some gifts to try and help them. And the first human who was created, who got all of the gifts, she was named after that. So she became known as Pandora. So Pandora in Greek means, Dora means gift, Pan means all. It means the all-gifted, because she was given lots of different gifts by all of the gods. But Zeus was a little bit concerned, because if there were creatures now on Earth that were created in the image of the gods, then one day, of course, they might become strong enough to rival the gods. And if they can rival the gods, they might not need the gods anymore. And Zeus became very upset about this. And so then he also gave a gift to Pandora, and one that maybe you might have heard of, and this then was the gift that would become humans' undoing. So he gave to her then, in the Greek stories at least, a jar. Now we have made, and you might have heard maybe of Pandora's box. So it's kind of a mistranslation of the original Greek. It actually was a little jar, but think Pandora's box. You're in the right track, okay? So Zeus gave to Pandora a box, and he told her, this is my gift to you. It is a very important box, but you must make sure never to open it. And what he was doing then is he was deliberately playing up to one human trait that is very unique among humans, but it can also, let's say, cause lots of problems as well. And that is our natural curiosity. So he gave it to her, said, whatever you do, don't open this box. But there you go, see you later. And was waiting, of course, for human curiosity to get the better of Pandora. So for weeks and months, she, looked at this box and inspected it and kept thinking, well, what's the worst that could possibly happen if I were just to peek inside and see what was inside? And so curiosity got the better of her. She looked inside the box, and the moment she looked inside, all of the horrors and evils of the world poured out. So murder and death and war and famine and all these horrible things that plagued humankind, they all spread out and went across the world. She tried to close the box, but it was too late. They'd all escaped. Okay? So this then was the Greeks' way of explaining why is there evil in the world? Because of course they looked around and said, well, why is it that people can live completely good lives and bad things might happen to them? It seems a very, very unfair world, of course, and in some ways it actually is. And so then they attributed it because the gods were angry at the Titans for creating human beings, and so they punished them, or at least Zeus did, by playing up deliberately to our natural curiosity. So it says quite a lot about the Greeks, that they saw curiosity as, of course, a very important thing that is unique to humans, but also something, of course, that might be potentially dangerous. If you get a little bit too curious, it might become your undoing. So in ancient Greece then, after the gods had taken over the earth and after the first humans had been created, for a while, gods and monsters and humans all lived together on the earth. So the Greeks then, of course, naturally looked around and said to themselves, well, why is it then there's no gods or there's no monsters today? We're told in our mythology they were everywhere. We're told that there was all these mythological beasts and gods walking the earth. Why is it that I can't see any today? And so they explain that then in with this story, let's say, or this group of stories, that after the first humans were created, then a new generation came along, and this generation were the generation of heroes. And these were people like, as you can see on the vases here, Heracles or Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, these sorts of famous Jason, these sorts of famous heroes. And their role then was to go throughout the Greek world and defeat mythological beasts. So a lot of them are tasked with ridding the world, let's say, of the final few monsters that plagued it. And so, of course, they were successful, and all of these horrible beasts are now gone. So on the vases that I gave you to have a look at, you can see two that have Hercules on them. So the very top one and top left one and the bottom one. In the top left one, you can see Hercules, and he's just turned back to the court of a king called Eurystheus. So according to Greek legends, Heracles or Hercules was driven mad by Hera, and he murdered a load of people. And in fact, actually, he murdered his own family. And so to atone for that, he went to the court of King Eurystheus, and Eurystheus told him that he must complete 12 labours, 12 challenges, let's say, of increasing difficulty, and if he can overcome these challenges, he would have atoned for his sins. And so one of the challenges, which is depicted, actually both challenges are depicted on there, but the top left one, is one of those challenges that's been depicted. So Eurystheus told Heracles that he wants him to go down to the underworld and to recover the watchdog or the guardian dog of the underworld itself. So there was a dog that used to guard the gates of the underworld, a three-headed dog, if that's maybe giving any clues if you were unsure of who it was. And so he went down there and managed to recover it. And that then is the depiction of Heracles turning back triumphantly, let's say, to the court of Eurystheus with Cerberus. So you might have heard of the dog, the three-headed dog who guarded the underworld, and that there is Cerberus himself. And you can see the artist has made each of the three heads different colours, like different coloured fur. So of course it's very clear that there's three heads there. And according to the story, when Eurystheus saw, of course, the terrifying, hellhound, the beast of the underworld turning up in his court, he panicked so much, he fell into a jar and tried to hide in it. So it shows the moment Heracles turns up, the guy on the right, with his lion skin cap and his club, with Cerberus, and Eurystheus is panicking and hiding in his silly jar. Okay? The one at the bottom then is also a depiction of Heracles. So another one of the stories is that he had to defeat the Hydra. And so the Hydra then was this serpent, but as you can see in the picture, it was many-headed. It had lots of different heads. Now Heracles, of course, he was kind of known for being, and you might have maybe seen the Disney movie, in which case you'd have seen the depiction of the Hydra, and I think Cerberus is in it. But he was known for taking a quite, let's say, direct approach to dealing with problems. He was incredibly strong. He was the son of Zeus, of course. And so he decided, well, if there's a problem, if there's a monster that needs to be slain, I'll take it out single-handedly by myself. And so with the Hydra, he tried that approach at first. He came along and he began to club and hack off all of the heads of the Hydra, thinking, cut off the head, of course, and literally cut the head off the snake, and you kill the monster. The problem was, and as you can see, it's been depicted in the vase here, is that when you cut off one of the heads of the Hydra, two heads grew in its place. And so if you kept cutting them off, of course, it became like an impossible challenge. Just more and more heads kept growing and growing and growing. And so the scene here then depicts that moment with Heracles. You can see him on the right with his club and again his lion skin hat on. And he's got one of the snake heads by the jaws, like snakes up by the jaws, but by the head, let's say, and he's just about to cut it off, okay? But of course, he's already failed, hasn't he, because the heads are starting to multiply. In the end, he realised that the best way to defeat them is to cut the head off and then to douse the neck with fire and sort of cauterise the wound, and that stopped them from growing. So on the right then, on the left, you can see one of his assistants who is also cutting off heads, and the two of them together cut the heads off, cauterised the wound with flames, and that stopped it from growing, and he defeated the Hydra. The last vase on the top right depicts a very famous scene, but one that might have been a little bit hard to spot because the figures are all in that particular style, aren't they? They all have that sort of like black colour to them, which was a very common style of, you can see it in the other ones, can't you? Common style of Greek vase depictions. But what gives away this one is if you look at the monster, which is the one on the right, you can see his head is something that is quite unique. So the rest of the body looks like a human being, but it's the head, if you can see, is the head of a bull. Okay, so this then is the story of the Minotaur. So you might have heard the story of the Minotaur living in the labyrinth, which was a big, labyrinth is in the name, isn't it? Underneath the palace of Knossos on Crete. And it used to then be fed every single year helpless victims to sort of satiate its greed. To stop it attacking people, it would be sent down there. That people would be sent down there, as like a sacrifice. So Theseus, the character on the left, the hero of this story, went down to the labyrinth to defeat the Minotaur. And as you might have maybe heard in this story, of course, the issue with a labyrinth is it's a labyrinth, it's a maze, and you might very, very easily get lost. And so to overcome that then, he tied around his waist a silk threads. He left that at the entrance, and of course it allowed him to track his way back out. So he went into the labyrinth, slew the Minotaur, which is the scene that's being depicted here. You can see the blood gouging out from the Minotaur's neck, and he's also holding in his hand a bit of blood as well, when he must have been stabbed elsewhere. And Theseus is just killing him, and then of course he's going to be able to escape afterwards and get out of the labyrinth. So these then are these stories that explain, well, why is it then, like we said, that there are no mythological beasts anywhere today? It's because of heroes like Hercules and Theseus who tackle these monsters head on and through their bravery and courage save the other humans from their terrifying grip. So the last three vases depict myths that we might put under the category of psychological myths. On the top left and the top right, we have depictions of individuals who in some way had defied the gods. And the gods of ancient Greece, unlike maybe perhaps more modern religions, were not kind and benevolent. They were far more crueler, and if angered, they could punish individuals in quite cruel and unusual ways. So on the left, we have the story of a man named Actaeon. He was a hunter, and one day, whilst on a hunt in the wilds, he came across a stream. And in the stream, he noticed there was a woman bathing. Rather, of course, than turn away and preserve the woman's dignity, he instead hid and spied on her, and only at the end realized that this was no woman whatsoever. It was instead the goddess Artemis. And so on the left, you can see the goddess represented. So Artemis is the god of quite a few different things. She's first of all an archer, and so you can see her with her bow and arrow about to shoot poor Actaeon, looking defenseless on the floor. But most importantly, she was the goddess of the wilds, and so this was her territory. She was also the goddess of the moon and childbirth, and sort of wild animals and these sorts of domains, let's say. So when she noticed that Actaeon was spying her from the woods, she became incredibly enraged that this mere mortal would have the gall, let's say, to defy her like that. And so she punished him in the cruelest way she could think of. She turned him, first of all, into a stag, and then she set his own hunting dogs to hunt him. And on the scene then you can see depicted here, poor Actaeon being devoured by his own dogs. On the right, we see two individuals who were punished by Zeus. So Zeus, of course, king of the gods, would also devise cruel punishments for those he felt had defied him personally. These two, though, are not human beings, they're in fact titans. On the left, the man who looks like he's holding up something is the titan Atlas. So Atlas was one of the chief lieutenants of the Titans, and when the gods rose up in defiance against the Titans, a war was fought called the Titanomachy. The gods won, and then Zeus decided to punish the ones who had shown the most resistance against the gods in, again, ways that he felt sort of suited, let's say, the crimes they committed. So Atlas was punished to hold up the earth and heavens for all time. And you can see on the picture there, on the vase there, him holding up the heavens and struggling under its weight. You can see him sort of with his hand on his back, clearly buckling under the pressure. Now, Atlas is still honoured in the modern world in maps, because you might know that, of course, another name for a map is an atlas. And the way we come to that was that in medieval maps, they would normally draw Atlas in a little homage to him, sort of holding up the map, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke, let's say. And over time, the two names become synonymous. So Atlas map comes from the story that can be depicted here. On the right then is another titan, and this is the titan Prometheus. So Prometheus, as we did discuss earlier, was one of the titans who created man. He made us out of clay, according to Greek mythology, and he took pity on us. We were sort of quite helpless. Of course, poor Pandora had been punished by Zeus for his his fear, let's say, of what humans might become. And so Prometheus decided he was also going to give us a gift, something that he thought might help us navigate, let's say, the dangers of life. So he decided then he was going to steal fire from the god Hephaestus' workshop. He came down to Earth, gave humans the gift of fire, and allowed us, let's say, to build technology and to sort of shape the world around us and build cities and towns and houses and everything else. This angered Zeus so much, fearing, of course, the potential this might cause. If humans become so powerful that they don't need the gods anymore, then, of course, what point is there in worshipping people like Zeus? And so he punished Prometheus by tying him to a rock, and every single day, a vulture would swoop down, land on his chest, and peck out his liver. At the end of the day, his liver would regrow, and the vulture would return. And so you can see both these two then, both defies of Zeus, being punished in their very cruel and unusual ways. On the bottom then depicts the story of Odysseus and some mythological beasts that tried to hunt him. So in the story of the Odyssey, one of the stories that you will be studying if you do pick up classical civilization at New College, Odysseus then was a hero of the Trojan Wars. He actually was the guy who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse, which people quite a famous story of how the Greeks got into the city and managed to capture it. After the sack of the city, he became so brazen and so arrogant, let's say, for him having won the war for the Greeks, that the gods become angry at him. And in particular, Poseidon became very angry, and so he punished Odysseus to have to sail the world for 10 years before he was able to get home. And it took him 10 years of sailing throughout the world and encountering all sorts of mythological beasts and dangers until he was able to get back to his beloved wife Penelope back home in Ithaca, which is in modern-day Greece. So on this scene then, on this vase, it depicts one of the moments in the Odyssey, which is when Odysseus sails past a group of sirens. So sirens then, as you can see depicted on the vase, are women that have, they're birds with the face of women. And they sit on rocks near to, sit on jagged rocks, along the shoreline. And what they would do is they would sing songs to sailors as they sailed by. You might have heard maybe of the siren song or the siren's call. And their voices were so enchanting that men would naturally be drawn to the rocks, and they would crash their ships and become shipwrecked. Now Odysseus, in his ever sort of defiant way, let's say, in his ever quite clever way, so Odysseus would be known for being a quite clever and sneaky hero, let's say, he decided he wanted to still hear the siren song. He wanted to pass by the sirens and hear them and try and live, of course. And so what he did then was, and you can see this depicted in the scene itself, he had his men tie him to a mast. And so he was sort of unable, let's say, to break free and try and swim to the shore or navigate his ship into the rocks. And his own sailors then, he got them to fill and plug their ears full of wax. So when they sailed past the sirens circled the boat, as you can see, of course, depicted on the scene here, sang their songs trying to lure the men towards the beaches and towards the jagged rocks. But his own men couldn't hear anything because, of course, they had the wax in their ears. And Odysseus, though he could hear them, was so tied up that he couldn't break free and was able to sail through unharmed. And so he managed to dupe the sirens. So in terms of these stories then and how they might connect to psychological myths, what you might say is then that these each represent ways in which the Greeks viewed the world and the reason why certain things happen, let's say. So we tend to think of nature as being something, that we maybe spend a weekend, let's say, going to a national park and having a walk around, or we might maybe spend some time walking in the woods or in a park. But of course, we do still live in quite nice, comfortable lives in the cities, don't we, really? For the ancient Greeks, of course, the wilderness was still far more prevalent. They hadn't really tamed the wilderness like the modern world had. And so it was a far more dangerous and wild place. And so the story of Actaeon then becomes a story to represent man's fear, let's say, of the dangers of the wild. And Artemis, being a very unpredictable and quite dangerous goddess, as you can of course see in the story here, is someone then who is a metaphor, let's say, for the dangers that the wilds can offer. On the right then, the stories of Prometheus and Atlas also represent, let's say then, the powerlessness that men felt towards the gods. That they saw the gods, like we said, as fickle and cruel, and to defy them, of course, was to get them punishments, and so it was a way of them explaining why certain people are punished for things. That when something bad happened to someone, they didn't think maybe, oh, that's because I'm potentially, let's say, a bad person. Their first go-to might be, maybe I've offended the gods in some way, and I need to sort of appease them. And of course, if you don't, like poor Prometheus and Atlas, you of course might be, sort of end up punished by them in some sort of cruel way. Odysseus then, and the story of the sirens and mythological beasts like the sirens are a way of explaining then sometimes how natural disasters might occur. So of course they didn't understand the natural world as much as we do, and like we said, because the wilds were so dangerous and nature was of course far more dangerous than in the modern world, things sometimes could happen that they couldn't explain. So very often, people might sail away from a port in their little wooden ships across the sea, and they are never seen of again. And of course, we might say, well, of course, the sea is a very dangerous place, and maybe something might have happened to them on their voyage across. For the Greeks, though, they sort of always felt like everything must have had a reason, and so they would blame it on certain dangers that might lurk in the dangerous waters around the safety of the land. So sirens, then, are a perfect representation of why sometimes things like sailors might sometimes sail away and never come back home. So I hope that gave you a bit of a sense of what classical civilization is like and the types of things that we study. If you'd like any more information about the course itself, more information is available on the website. So if you go to the Classical Civilization course page, there's detailed information about what types of topics we study, what career paths it can lead into, what subjects it complements, all those types of information. If you'd like any other questions that aren't answered on the course page, at the very bottom, my contact details are on there. You're always welcome to send me a message, an email, and I'm happy to respond to you. I hope that was enjoyable, and I hope maybe to perhaps see you at some point in the near future. So take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.